Cairo International Airport, Egypt, March 14th, 1982, 6:47 a.m. A Boeing 707 painted in the distinctive livery of Mediterranean Air Charter, a small European carrier that operates charter flights between North Africa and the Mediterranean, taxis to a remote stand at Cairo's International Airport. The aircraft's registration is Swiss, its crew speaks English with various European accents, and its manifest lists 37 passengers traveling from Athens to Cairo en route to a petroleum industry conference in Alexandria. To Egyptian customs officials who process the flight, everything appears routine. The charter company has proper documentation, its insurance is current, and it's filed all required arrival notifications. The passengers, petroleum engineers, geological consultants, equipment sales representatives carry credentials that match their stated purpose. Their luggage contains exactly what one would expect: technical manuals, sample equipment catalogs, business cards from companies that exist and employ people whose names match the passports being inspected. What Egyptian officials cannot know, what they have no reason to suspect, is that Mediterranean Air Charter doesn't actually exist. The Boeing 707 is owned through a shell corporation registered in Liechtenstein, operated by pilots who work for Israeli intelligence, and the 37 passengers are Mossad operatives, Israeli military intelligence officers, and technical specialists whose actual mission has nothing to do with petroleum and everything to do with the intelligence operation that will unfold over the next 72 hours across Cairo, Alexandria, and the Sinai Peninsula. This is the story of how Mossad created an entire airline as operational cover, not just a fake business on paper, but a functioning commercial aviation operation with real aircraft, legitimate flight schedules, and the kind of meticulous attention to detail that allowed Israeli intelligence to operate freely across Middle Eastern countries that were technically at war with Israel, using commercial aviation as the perfect cover for moving agents, equipment, and intelligence that would have been impossible to transport through any other means. The concept: Tel Aviv, Israel, November 1980, Mossad headquarters. The briefing that would eventually create Mediterranean Air Charter began with a problem that Israeli intelligence had been struggling with for years: how to deploy operatives across the Middle East and North Africa without using Israeli passports, El Al flights, or any obvious connection to Israel that would trigger security scrutiny in countries where Israeli citizens were prohibited or heavily monitored. "We need mobility," explained David Kimchi, Deputy Director of Mossad's Operations Division, to the assembled senior officers whose approval would be required for what he was about to propose. "Our operations in Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, even countries nominally at peace with us, are constrained by the visibility problem. We can create false identities, forge documents, establish cover employment, but we can't solve the fundamental issue. How do our people physically enter and exit these countries without leaving traces that hostile intelligence can track?" The traditional solutions had limitations. Individual operatives traveling on forged passports worked for small-scale missions, but couldn't move the teams required for complex operations. Using third-country nationals as cutouts was possible, but created security vulnerabilities and limited operational control. Infiltration by sea or across borders worked for specific targets, but couldn't provide the regular access that sustained intelligence collection required. "What if we owned the transportation?" Kimche proposed. "Not just fake documents for our people to travel on commercial flights, but the entire aircraft, a charter airline that appears completely legitimate, that flies regular commercial routes, that develops relationships with aviation authorities across the region, an airline that happens to be entirely owned and operated by Israeli intelligence." The concept was audacious and expensive. Creating a functioning airline required aircraft, crews, maintenance infrastructure, commercial relationships with airports and handling agents, insurance, regulatory approvals from aviation authorities in multiple countries, and the sustained operational security to prevent anyone from discovering that this supposedly independent European charter company was actually an Israeli intelligence front. The Americans did something similar with Air America in Southeast Asia during Vietnam, noted another officer. CIA owned an entire airline that operated commercial and military contracts while providing cover for intelligence operations. It worked for years before the exposure. Air America was eventually compromised because it became too visible, too connected to American operations, Kim Che countered. We designed this differently. Mediterranean air charter will be genuinely commercial. It will fly real passengers, conduct actual charter operations, make enough money to be financially sustainable. The intelligence missions will be a small percentage of total flights, buried within legitimate operations that create the perfect cover. The proposal went up the chain to Prime Minister Menachem Begin, whose approval was required for operations of this scale and sensitivity. Begin authorized the project with one critical caveat. The airline must be completely deniable. If exposed, Israel would deny all knowledge, claim the company was private enterprise, and distance itself from whatever diplomatic or legal consequences resulted. Operation Skybridge was born, the code name for creating and operating an airline that would serve as transportation for Israeli intelligence across the Middle East for the next decade. Building the legend. Creating a believable airline required starting from legitimate foundations. Mossad couldn't simply paint Israeli aircraft with fake livery and hope no one investigated. Aviation is one of the world's most regulated industries. Every aircraft has a registration number tied to ownership documents. Every airline requires operating certificates from civil aviation authorities. Every international flight must file manifests with departure and arrival countries. The operation began in Switzerland, where banking secrecy and corporate privacy laws made it ideal for establishing shell companies whose true ownership could be obscured through layers of holding companies and nominee directors. Mediterranean Air Charter SA was incorporated in Geneva in January 1981 as a commercial aviation company specializing in charter operations throughout Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. The company's ownership traced through a Liechtenstein trust to a Cyprus-based investment fund to a Luxembourg holding company, each layer adding complexity that made determining actual control nearly impossible for anyone without access to confidential financial records that Swiss law protected aggressively. The beneficial owners listed on incorporation documents were retired European aviation executives who'd been recruited by Mossad through approaches disguised as legitimate business opportunities, offered director fees and minimal responsibilities in exchange for lending their names and credentials to a company they believed was genuine commercial aviation venture. The next requirement was aircraft, buying used Boeing 707s from European carriers retiring their older fleets. Mediterranean Air Charter acquired 3 aircraft over 18 months. Each was registered in Switzerland, underwent extensive maintenance to bring them to commercial operating standards, and was painted in livery that looked professional but unremarkable. Blue and white color scheme, generic Mediterranean imagery, the kind of corporate identity that dozens of small charter carriers employed. The aircraft were expensive, approximately $3 million per plane, plus another $1 million each for refurbishment, maintenance, and operational preparation. But the investment was justified by the operational capability it provided, the ability to move teams of 30-40 operatives at a time, with equipment and supplies, into countries where individual infiltration would have been detected or impossible. Critically, the aircraft actually flew commercial operations. Mediterranean Air Charter contracted with tour operators to fly European tourists to North African beach resorts, with oil companies to transport workers to petroleum facilities across Libya and Egypt, with aid organizations to move cargo and personnel to development projects in Sudan and Somalia. The commercial operations were real, the revenues actual, the reputation built through delivering reliable charter services that clients recommended to others. The best cover is a cover that isn't cover, explained the Mossad officer managing the airline's operations. If Mediterranean air charter only flew when we had intelligence missions, someone would notice the pattern. By flying 200-plus commercial operations annually, with maybe 15 to 20 intelligence missions buried within that volume, we create genuine operational history that makes investigation reveal exactly what we want revealed. A functioning airline doing exactly what its documentation claims. The first operation. The inaugural intelligence mission using Mediterranean air charter occurred in August 1981, a flight from Geneva to Khartoum, Sudan, ostensibly carrying agricultural consultants for a United Nations development project, actually transporting a Mossad team whose mission was establishing networks for what would later become Operation Moses, the covert evacuation of Ethiopian Jews through Sudan. The operation demonstrated both the potential and the complications of using an airline as intelligence cover. The advantages were obvious. The team entered Sudan legally, with documentation that withstood customs inspection, their equipment classified as technical supplies for agricultural projects rather than communications gear and intelligence equipment. They moved freely within Sudan, their cover employment providing legitimate reasons to travel to regions where Ethiopian refugees were gathering. Their presence unremarkable among the dozens of international aid workers operating across the country. But the operation also revealed vulnerabilities. Sudanese intelligence was sophisticated enough to monitor foreign nationals, even those with legitimate UN credentials. The team had to maintain their agricultural consultant covers even when conducting intelligence work, attending actual UN meetings, producing reports on development projects, maintaining relationships with real UN personnel who'd expect ongoing engagement from colleagues they believed were genuine consultants. The cover can't be a costume we put on and take off, reported the team leader after the Sudan mission. We have to live the cover continuously, which means actually doing the jobs we claim to be doing, which consumes time and energy that would otherwise go to intelligence work. It's more secure than traditional covert operations, but it's also more demanding because maintaining authenticity requires genuine performance. The lesson shaped how Mediterranean air charter would be used for subsequent operations. Intelligence missions would be designed to leverage legitimate commercial activities rather than creating purely fictitious covers. Operatives would be trained in the professional roles they'd assume, and operations would be sustained over months or years rather than quick in-and-out missions that might expose the airline's actual purpose. The Cairo operation, by March 1982, Mediterranean Airs. Charter had established sufficient operational history and regional reputation to attempt more ambitious missions. The Cairo operation involved transporting Israeli intelligence officers into Egypt, technically at peace with Israel following the 1979 Camp David Accords, but still a country where Israeli intelligence operations remained highly sensitive, and where detection would create significant diplomatic complications. The mission's objective was establishing intelligence networks that would monitor Egyptian military modernization, track Soviet weapons deliveries, and assess whether Egypt's formal peace with Israel translated into genuine strategic realignment or whether it was tactical pause in a conflict that would inevitably resume. The intelligence was critical for Israeli strategic planning. Understanding Egyptian military capabilities and intentions affected every aspect of Israel's defense posture. But deploying Mossad officers into Cairo was extraordinarily risky. Egyptian intelligence services, despite cooperation agreements with Israeli counterparts on terrorism and regional security, maintained aggressive counterintelligence programs targeting Israeli espionage. Egyptian military officers who'd lost wars to Israel retained deep animosity that complicated bilateral relations despite diplomatic normalization. And the Egyptian public remained broadly hostile to Israel, making any exposure of Israeli intelligence operations politically explosive. Mediterranean air charter provided the solution. The petroleum conference cover gave the team legitimate reason to be in Egypt. The aircraft's Swiss registration avoided any Israeli association, and the operatives' European passports and professional credentials made them appear as exactly what their documentation claimed: technical consultants whose business happened to bring them to Cairo. The 37 passengers who deplaned that March morning dispersed across Cairo and Alexandria, checking into hotels, attending conference sessions, meeting with Egyptian petroleum industry contacts who had no idea they were actually meeting with intelligence officers, gathering information about Egyptian military-industrial infrastructure, Soviet advisory presence, and the reliability of Egyptian commitments to peace agreements that Israeli leaders still viewed with suspicion. Over 72 hours, the team conducted operations that would have taken months to execute using traditional infiltration methods, recruited Egyptian sources who believed they were providing information to European consultants for commercial purposes, placed surveillance equipment in facilities that legitimate conference attendees had access to, and gathered intelligence that filled gaps in Israeli understanding of Egyptian strategic intentions. The operation concluded with the team returning to the airport, boarding the same Mediterranean air charter aircraft, and departing Cairo exactly as they'd arrived, seemingly unremarkable European professionals completing a business trip, actually Mossad operatives who just conducted one of the most successful intelligence operations in Egypt since the peace treaty. The success confirmed what Operation Skybridge's architects had believed: controlling the entire transportation infrastructure, not just documents or covers, but the actual aircraft and logistics, provided intelligence capabilities that traditional methods couldn't match, but it also attracted attention that would eventually compromise everything they'd built. The expansion. Between 1982 and 1984, Mediterranean air charters operations expanded dramatically. What began as experimental intelligence transportation evolved into a comprehensive capability that allowed Mossad to operate across regions where Israeli presence would have been impossible through traditional means. The airline flew operations into Yemen, delivering what appeared to be humanitarian supplies, but actually included equipment for tracking Soviet military advisors supporting the Marxist government in South Yemen. Into Jordan, transporting businessmen who were actually Israeli military intelligence officers, assessing Palestinian refugee camps, and monitoring Syrian troop movements near the Golan Heights. Into Sudan, Morocco, Tunisia, countries where diplomatic relations with Israel ranged from hostile to non-existent, but where commercial charter flights from a European company raised no particular suspicion. The operational model was consistent. Real commercial contracts provided cover for intelligence missions, genuine passengers mixed with operatives to create authenticity, and legitimate business activities generated the paper trail and operational history that made Mediterranean air charter appear exactly what its documentation claimed. The airline's success created internal debate within Mossad about operational security versus capability expansion. Conservative officers argued that increasing the frequency of intelligence missions raised the statistical probability of detection. Each operation was a roll of dice, and rolling repeatedly meant eventually coming up wrong. Aggressive officers countered that the airline's commercial success actually made intelligence operations safer by creating more legitimate activity within which covert missions could hide. The debate was resolved through compromise. Mediterranean air charter would expand commercial operations faster than intelligence missions, maintaining a ratio where covert flights never exceeded 10% of total operations in any given quarter. The constraint frustrated operational planners who wanted maximum utilization of an expensive asset, but it preserved the cover that made the airline effective. The close call. The near exposure came in Libya in September 1983, during what should have been a routine charter flight transporting Italian oil workers from Tripoli to their company's desert facility. Among the passengers were 3 Mossad operatives whose actual mission involved placing surveillance equipment at locations near Libyan military installations, where Soviet advisors were training Gaddafi's forces on advanced weapon systems. The operation was compromised before it began. Libyan intelligence, tipped by Soviet counterparts who'd noticed unusual European business activity near sensitive military zones, had flagged the Mediterranean air charter flight for enhanced scrutiny. When the aircraft landed in Tripoli, security officials conducted a surprise inspection that went beyond routine customs procedures, examining luggage with equipment designed to detect electronic devices and communications gear. 2 of the 3 operatives were traveling clean. Their cover identities were genuine enough to withstand detailed investigation. Their equipment was commercial photography gear that matched their supposed roles as geological surveyors. But the 3rd operative, carrying specialized surveillance equipment disguised as seismic monitoring devices, was detained when Libyan inspectors' equipment detected electronic signatures that didn't match the declared contents. "These are restricted items," the Libyan security officer said in English, his tone suggesting this was already a concluded investigation rather than an inquiry. "You will accompany us for questioning about why you're attempting to import surveillance equipment into Libya without proper authorization." The operative, whose cover identity was Danish national working for a European geological firm, maintained his story with the disciplined calm of someone whose training had prepared for exactly this scenario. "These are seismic monitors for petroleum exploration. They detect ground vibrations to map underground formations. Your customs forms allow geological equipment for oil industry work. This is geological equipment." The explanation was technically accurate. The devices could monitor seismic activity, though their actual design allowed surveillance of military communications and vehicle movements. But Libyan security wasn't convinced. The inspection escalated from customs detention to intelligence interrogation, with the operative transferred to a facility where questioning became more aggressive and the threat of long-term imprisonment or worse became explicit. The crisis triggered emergency protocols back in Tel Aviv. Mediterranean air charter couldn't intervene directly without exposing its intelligence connections. Legitimate airlines don't dispatch legal teams and diplomatic pressure for detained passengers, unless those passengers are far more important than their cover identities suggest. But abandoning the operative wasn't acceptable either, both for moral reasons and because prolonged interrogation might break his cover and expose the airline's actual purpose. The solution came through indirect channels. The Europeans, geological firm listed as the operative's employer, actually a Mossad front company with legitimate commercial operations, filed diplomatic protests through Denmark's foreign ministry, characterizing the detention as harassment of foreign workers in Libya's petroleum sector. The Danish government, which had commercial interests in Libyan oil fields and no desire for bilateral complications, applied pressure on Libya to either charge the detainee with specific crimes or release him. After 11 days of detention that included interrogations the operative would later describe as psychologically aggressive but not physically violent, Libya released him with expulsion orders barring his return. The compromise allowed everyone to save face. Libya demonstrated vigilance against potential espionage. Denmark extracted its national from detention, and the geological firm maintained its commercial relationships without admitting any impropriety. But the close call exposed Mediterranean air charter's vulnerability. The airline's cover was intact. Libyan intelligence didn't connect the detained passenger to any broader operation or identify the airline as intelligence front. But the incident demonstrated that enhanced scrutiny could compromise individual operations even when overall operational security held. Mossad's response was to implement stricter protocols. Operatives would travel with equipment only when absolutely necessary. Surveillance gear would be shipped separately through commercial channels rather than carried as passenger baggage. And intelligence missions into countries with sophisticated counterintelligence capabilities would be limited to reduce cumulative exposure risk. Operation Moses. The pinnacle of Mediterranean Air Charter's operational life came between November 1984 and January 1985, when the airline became critical infrastructure for Operation Moses, the covert evacuation of approximately 8,000 Ethiopian Jews from refugee camps in Sudan to Israel. Ethiopian Jews had been fleeing drought, famine, and political persecution in Ethiopia for years, gathering in Sudanese refugee camps where conditions were desperate and international aid insufficient. Sudan, an Arab Muslim nation officially hostile to Israel, couldn't publicly facilitate their emigration to Israel without triggering diplomatic crisis with Arab League neighbors and domestic political backlash. But Sudan's government, facing its own economic and political challenges, was quietly willing to allow the evacuation if it could occur discreetly enough to maintain plausible deniability. The solution was covert airlift operation using aircraft that appeared to be commercial charters serving other purposes. Mediterranean Air Charter, along with another charter company, Trans-European Airways, which had its own intelligence connections, flew dozens of missions over 2 months, ostensibly transporting tourists from European beach resorts back to Switzerland and Belgium, actually flying empty outbound and returning with Ethiopian refugees who'd been transported from Sudanese camps to covert departure airfields. The operation required extraordinary coordination. Mossad operatives working under NGO covers moved refugees from camps to staging areas near remote airstrips. Sudanese officials were bribed to ignore nighttime movements of buses and aircraft activity at facilities supposedly closed for maintenance. European aviation authorities were convinced that slightly irregular flight schedules and passenger manifests reflected charter operation flexibility rather than intelligence activity. The Mediterranean air charter flights departed Sudan at night, their passenger manifests listing European tourists returning from Red Sea resorts, their actual cargo being Ethiopian Jewish families who'd survived journeys of hundreds of kilometers through desert to reach evacuation points. The aircraft would fly to Europe, where the refugees were processed through Israeli immigration facilities disguised as airline passenger services, then transported onward to Israel through separate channels. Over 8 weeks, the operation evacuated approximately 8,000 people, the largest covert airlift in Israeli intelligence history, accomplished through an airline that most participants believed was legitimate commercial carrier whose unusual schedules and routes reflected nothing more suspicious than charter operation logistics. The operation was eventually exposed when details leaked to media, triggering the diplomatic crisis Sudan had feared and forcing termination before all refugees could be evacuated. But by then, Mediterranean Air Charter had accomplished what traditional covert operations could never have achieved, moving thousands of people across international borders through an operation whose scale required the infrastructure and legitimacy that only a functioning airline could provide. The exposure. The beginning of the end for Mediterranean Air Charter came not from the airline's own operations, but from parallel exposure of Israeli intelligence's use of commercial aviation as operational cover. In February 2015, South African intelligence documents leaked to media revealed that El Al, Israel's national airline, had been systematically used as intelligence cover for Mossad operations across Africa. Flight crews recruited as intelligence assets, aircraft carrying surveillance equipment, airline personnel facilitating operations that had nothing to do with commercial aviation. The revelations triggered investigations into other airlines with Israeli connections or suspicious operational patterns. Mediterranean Air Charter, which had been wound down in the late 1980s as the need for its specific capabilities diminished, came under retrospective scrutiny. Aviation authorities in countries where it had operated began examining historical records, looking for patterns that suggested intelligence activity rather than legitimate commercial operations. What they found confirmed suspicions but proved nothing definitively. Unusual flight schedules, Passengers whose backgrounds were difficult to verify? Financial transactions that flowed through the same Swiss banking networks used for intelligence operations, and operational decisions that made more sense from intelligence perspective than commercial aviation logic. But definitive proof was elusive because Mediterranean Air Charter had been designed from inception to withstand investigation. The airline's commercial operations were genuine, its financial records authentic, and its corporate structure sufficiently complex that determining beneficial ownership remained nearly impossible years after the company's dissolution. The operatives who traveled on its flights had used covers that were built to survive scrutiny, and the intelligence missions had been executed with enough compartmentalization that individual personnel couldn't expose the broader operation, even if they wanted to. The legacy. The story of Mediterranean Air Charter remains partially classified. Israeli intelligence has never officially acknowledged the airline's existence or purpose, maintaining the ambiguity that allows intelligence operations to be suspected but not proven, discussed but not documented, known through inference rather than admission. But the operational lessons have been absorbed into how intelligence agencies think about cover and infrastructure. The airline demonstrated that the most effective covers aren't thin disguises or false identities, but actual functioning enterprises that genuinely perform their stated purposes while also serving intelligence objectives. That building such covers requires massive investment but provides capabilities unavailable through traditional tradecraft. And that the lifespan of such operations is inherently limited because sustained use increases cumulative exposure risk until eventual compromise becomes statistical inevitability. Modern intelligence agencies continue to use commercial enterprises as operational cover, technology companies that actually develop software while providing access to networks, security firms that genuinely protect clients while collecting intelligence, humanitarian NGOs that deliver real aid while observing conditions in denied areas. The methodology evolves with changing technology and geopolitics, but the fundamental principle remains. The best cover is the one that isn't cover at all, but rather a legitimate operation that happens to serve dual purposes. For the operatives who flew on Mediterranean Air Charter's intelligence missions, the experience was surreal. Conducting espionage while seated in commercial aircraft among genuine passengers, maintaining covers that required actually doing the jobs they claimed while simultaneously collecting intelligence, and living the particular cognitive dissonance of people whose professional lives existed in the space between authentic and fabricated, where every interaction was both genuine and performance, depending on which purpose it served. You become the cover. One former operative later reflected in testimony that carefully avoided details that remain classified. You're not pretending to be a petroleum consultant. You actually know petroleum consulting well enough to discuss it competently with genuine consultants, which means you've invested hundreds of hours learning material that has nothing to do with your actual mission. The effectiveness comes from authenticity, but the cost is that you're never entirely sure which version of yourself is real and which is operational necessity. That psychological cost, the erosion of identity that comes from sustained deep cover operations, is rarely discussed in intelligence histories that focus on operational success rather than human consequences. But it's part of the price that Mediterranean Air Charter's operatives paid for the capabilities the airline provided. The ability to move freely across regions where Israeli presence would have been impossible, to conduct operations that traditional espionage couldn't accomplish, and to demonstrate that in the world of intelligence, even the sky isn't neutral territory, but rather another operational domain, where commercial infrastructure can be weaponized for strategic purposes. Somewhere in Israeli intelligence archives, there's a file documenting Mediterranean Air Charter's operations. Missions flown, intelligence collected, people evacuated, operational outcomes achieved. The file is classified at levels that ensure it won't be declassified for decades, if ever. but its existence represents the operational history of an airline that was both completely real and entirely fictional, depending on whether you measured reality by documentation and commercial operations or by actual purpose and strategic intent. And in the ongoing shadow war where intelligence agencies operate, the concept that Mediterranean Air Charter pioneered, creating entire commercial enterprises as intelligence infrastructure, continues to define how covert operations are conducted in an era where traditional espionage has given way to operations so sophisticated that the line between legitimate business and intelligence activity becomes indistinguishable by design and with consequences that extend far beyond any single operation's immediate objectives.